I thought I might take you back to around about 1960, when I first came across your work as a country schoolmaster in western Nigeria. Now, round about that time, I remember, well, we thought of you as rather a Byronic figure, you know. You would, you were said to have gone into the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation and taken off this speech by the Prime Minister and substituted a speech of your own. Then after that, we had the administrator took over Western Nigeria, Mr. Dumni, and we remembered you and your mocking satirical song, ending up, may yogi spikes ne'er pierce thy seat, nor boots cramp two left feet. This I remember well. And then we knew, of course, of your play for Independence Day, A Dream of the Forests, and we thought it was, I say this is rather like a Midsummer Night's Dream. We knew your play, Brother Jero. Now, oh, and your most famous poem at that time, I suppose, was Telephone Conversation, about the colour-conscious landlady in London. Now, looking back on those years, when you were, I suppose, really rather a light-hearted young writer, really, do you feel that your work of that time is the sort of thing you'd like to be remembered by, the sort of thing you take to a desert island with you, or do you think you've gone past those years altogether?
Well, first of all, I think it's always a mistake to try and split one's sort of creative consciousness or obsessions into periods. I have always been, and I still am, in certain respects, a light-hearted writer. I enjoy writing my satires, spiking two left feet from time to time. I mean, that part of me, I hope, never changes, because I think the whole business of writing would be most dreadful, and sort of the sort of heavier burdens of one's major concerns would be intolerable if one didn't have if one wasn't able to see the ridiculous aspect of life, especially when one can direct such a sense of the ridiculous to pomp and power, especially of an occasionally suffocating side. But I would also like to mention that at the same time as I was writing that kind of stuff. I mean, Dance of the Forest certainly wasn't a light-hearted one. It was a very jaundiced and a serious look at what I considered our historical heritage, my historical heritage as a black man in a so-called developing, colonized society. And this was, of course, begun even at the same time as I was writing some of that satirical stuff. When I was here as a student here, for instance, and I was beginning to write seriously, as they say. I don't really know when one doesn't write seriously, to tell you the truth. I was attached to the Royal Court, and I participated in some improvised, sort of part musical, song and almost agitprop um, statements, dramatic statements on apartheid South Africa. I took part in the writing and the acting out of the massacre of the Mamao detainees, the Royal Court Theatre. At the same time as I was writing poems about the detonation of the French atomic bomb in the Sahara, I mean, which obviously were, for me, not funny matters at all. These poems were recited on the Royal Court stage, side by side with the play The Invention, which was set in apartheid South Africa, and was a satirical approach to the whole obscenity of apartheid. So for me, these have always been simultaneous techniques of addressing the basic concerns of my existence, of my environment, and as I said, of the kind of heritage which I believe that I, as a member of my society, recently so-called freed, society from the colonial shackles, the kind of things which one was basically preoccupied with. But you see, one must choose one's instrument very carefully. You talked about the administrator, for instance, of that region at the time. First of all, this was a medical doctor. I didn't see what business he was turning himself into an autocrat in midday. I also happened to know a little bit about him. I didn't think him competent. And he came into his job not with any sense of coming to remedy a violent situation. Not, he came in like, unfortunately, like many people in our part of the world and in other parts of the world also come into a position of responsibility like that, literally as a conqueror, preceded by, followed by, sirens. I mean, there was this little country doctor, who should have gone about his job seriously, modestly. The first thing he thought about was the panoply of power. I mean, how do you deal with people like that? Surely not seriously. You must try and make, and you see, the aura, the redolence of power is very infectious. So before people whom he's come to govern take him too seriously, it's important that he be strict slightly. I mean, that has always been my approach to power. So it's different techniques all the time.
Yes, and you have been, in fact, a satirist and a tragedian and a comedian, really, haven't you? Different periods and all in different moods, we might say.
That's
according
correct.
to the nature of the problem. When I came across your work later on, about 63 in London, I remember reading The Interpreters, and I remember first hearing in Tribune offices, which is where I was working, your response to Negritude, where we had the Dyker antelope is not known for his Dykertude, the tiger is not known for his Tigeritude, but for his elegant leap. And we all rather liked this. It seemed almost as if Soyinka had moved from complaints, as I say, against white colonialism and of certain aspects of government in Africa towards a complaint against the French concept of negritude and a wrong-headed attitude towards the nature of African literature and African experience.
Yes, let's get the quote very carefully, by the way. I said the tiger does not proclaim his tigritude. You recognize the tigritude when he pounces, just as the Dyker doesn't proclaim his Dykeritude, that you recognize it by the elegant leap. Now, the distinction is very important. I found, not to my taste, the promotion of a special a special black humanism for its own sake, right in the midst of obvious tyranny, inequalities in society, and in fact the very reality of our struggle, during colonialism. I mean, we came back from being students, in European countries where we had of course been nauseated and assailed daily by incidences of racism, even the injustices in other societies. But we came back to a society that was determined to try and build a kind of a reasonably just, comparatively just society. And what did we find? We found our so-called leaders only too happy to be stepping into the shoes of the colonial masters, practicing the very ills against their own kind, which we were determined to crush. So then, what price the taken for granted humanism and black values, which are supposed to be peculiar to the endemic race, this was being constantly disproved. And then there was, of course, it was very heavily romanticized. The poetry, in fact, became of a rather gushing kind. In retrospect, of course, and this is a question which has come up lots and lots of times, I refused at the time to do this, to distinguish between French colonialism and English colonialism, which were very different qualitatively. In Portuguese, Spanish colonialism and French colonialism, there was the policy of assimilados. And it is quite true that the French, the Francophone colonials, needed, historically speaking, an instrument like this. They needed an instrument like this to really free themselves from an experience which we did not have. The Anglophone countries, mostly because the British did not think that blacks could ever even attain to their level of civilization. They did not actively, they did not really create a structure whereby you could become a black Englishman, a black Britisher. The French, and to some extent the Portuguese, assiduously cultivated this. So the students who found themselves in you know, the sidewalks of the Parisian cafes would, for a long time, imagine, and in fact, the ambition was to, be accepted as Frenchmen. I mean, they took exams. I mean, this thing was very, very notoriously structured. They could take exams whereby they were then recognized as, shall we say, honorary, like in South Africa, honorary Frenchmen. And so the struggle against this required that kind of instrument. But I believe that it was taken way over and beyond a political instrument. It became a cult. It became a kind of a yardstick for the judging of literature. And it wasn't just the Frenchmen. There were the opportunist critics of various ilks, both expatriate and, African critics, who jumped on the bandwagon of Negritude and literally began to assess literature coming from Africa in negritudinous terms, whereas there were raw, urgent issues being tackled by very serious writers on so many levels, and these were not getting any, the kind of attention which they deserved. So it is a very complex situation at the time, and perhaps in retrospect, we could have been a little bit gentler with the historic excuse, I'll put it that way, excuse of this particular movement. But definitely it was not acceptable at the time.
I remember one Nigerian chief, Remy something, bringing out a book called Blackism, which seemed to be an imitation of Negritude. Since then this word black has spread around the world, so we're all supposed to say black all the time, rather than, as we used to say, coloured or something like that, And I think there's an idea now for using the Roundhouse in London for black theatre, with meant to be for Americans, West Indians, Africans, anybody who happens to be black. Do you think this is a useful move around the world, this attitude towards using the word black?
Yes, before I come to the second question, let me just amplify again what I was saying before by this interesting reference of yours. Now, this was a character, this chief, I won't mention his name because I've just been through a libel case, and I find there are all sorts of technicalities in what in what you say and what you don't say, which I never bothered about before. But now, this chief you're talking about, who brought out this blackism, he was somebody I described as the hatchet man of Chief Akintola. He was a fascist, an out-and-out fascist. The horrors which he perpetrated during that regime, are just unspeakable today. And predictably, he also joined the last government, in Nigeria, the NPN, which, as everybody now admits, long after we were screaming it, is easily the most notorious thieving and murderous bunch of, politicians who ever gather themselves, take hold of the reins of government, in Nigeria anyway. So this is a fellow using blackism, using the cult of black awareness, the very just principle of black awareness, which I've already emphasized, can be a very viable and sometimes, in certain political, socio-political situations, a necessary instrument against white racism. So there he was, purely opportunistic ploy. Wrote this as text while all the time he was putting his black boots on the neck of my black compatriots. Now, in societies like, and remember, I was in the States during the real hot months of black struggle. I visited the States in the early 60s. What sort of instrument, what more effective instrument of immediate identification, militant identification, can you have in a racist situation where a particular section of society has been downgraded because of their color? The way to begin is to first of all restore a sense of pride in that color. You begin from there. You tackle also the social issues, you tackle the political issues, but you begin first of all by affirming a quality in you which you were born with, which has been degraded. And so for me, the movement of blackness in the United States was absolutely valid, just as it would also be a very good starting point in South Africa, as has been the case over the last few years, which will restore, that the pride in yourself, the acceptance, because this is what it must boil down to in the end, absolute acceptance of yourself, and in which you're willing, in a very militant way, to tackle any further, especially structured attempt to reduce you to a non-person because of what you are. So on that level, I see no reason, why one should not recognize the validity of such a movement. Now, when you come to a country like the States, like the United Kingdom, you have, again, a qualitatively different situation. But don't forget also, there was a period of the Notting Hill riots when I was here. In fact, one of the poems I said, I read out at the Royal Court Theatre included something on about the murder, for instance, of that policeman, Kelso Cochrane, during the height of racism in London. And it should not be surprising with all the proven police brutality, police bias, against, the so-called sus law, which has been statistically proved, seem to catch, 75% more blacks than whites. So it is not therefore the blacks in the society here who have created a racial situation. It is the attitude of the host country here. And people like me who now live outside Britain, I never really lived in Britain, but I was a student here for a number of years, and if I could recognize the necessity for some kind of militant black movement when I was here during the Notting Hill riots, in which people were being assaulted daily, in which it was even necessary when I was working in the Royal Court Theatre to join a black vigilante group for our own self-protection. Well, I'm not really in a position to say categorically that the racial situation has changed that much, especially under this reactionary Thatcherian government. Having said that, however, I must say that I am, objectively speaking, I'm a little bit bothered by the sweeping, what I call the sweeping cult of minorities, so-called minorities, quote unquote, and the habit of equating the various aspects of minority disadvantage in societies. Now, I was asking, in fact, chatting with my publisher the other day, and asking him, is this thing I've just read in the Sunday Times true, that local councils are now sort of forming alternative governments for homosexuals, for blacks, for Pakistanis? It seems to me that a sense of, because of the historical prejudice against certain groups of people, it seems to me that a sense of proportion is being lost by so-called liberal societies. Problems which could be solved by a far more basic approach to the socio-economic levels of every member of society. These kind of diversionary game is being played now, in which we are now centering the problem, taking it away from the real issues and centering it on minority issues. Now, maybe that's the kind of danger you're referring to. As I say, as an outsider, not actually living here, I cannot speak categorically on it. But I must say, again, as an outsider, that I'm a little bit bemused by the exaggerated kind of mea culpa-ish cult which is growing up in various aspects of society. Very soon I expect that, you will now have special structures entirely for the handicapped, give them their own local government, whereas this is separating them all the more. What you must do is apply, the whole technological advantages of society like this, the entire even so-called welfare movement to cater for those who are obviously disadvantaged. I don't really believe in further ghettoizing of society. I don't, not this kind of society. I don't believe in it.
There is always a tendency for people who like to be thought of as liberal, like say the Kennedys in America, to gather in together all the minorities and add up their votes together, is there not? I think that's one of the things that happens, and it can happen when you're deciding to bring in handicapped people or decide all these Asians and Africans count as blacks,
Mm-hmm.
and get their minority vote, or like Americans finding the Irish minority or the Jewish minority. It's rather an American liberal scheme, I think, which probably, do you think, applies yet in African politics?
No, I don't think it applies in African politics very at the moment, except perhaps, ironically, in the country, societies which have just become liberated from colonialism, and which have consciously, to pacify or to reassure their white minorities, ex-master minorities, still need their technical expertise, and in any case, they want to build genuine multiracial societies. This has been the policy of, for instance, the ex-Portuguese, societies, and they may find themselves giving more and more, just to, assure these minorities. But you see, in I do not see, for instance, a country like Zimbabwe setting up a special white theater, for the simple reason that theater had been mostly white. So it is, in fact, you know, theater by Africans for Africans on African themes of immediate African liberation themes, which should preoccupy a government like that. Um, Art, however, is organic. All culture, the various cultural manifestations which we call art, have to grow from genuine societies. And I can see very easily a black theatre developing from a predominantly black area in London. If that happens, and in fact, if the beginnings of it become a manifest, I can also recognize the need for a policy which encourages, an art form, whether it's music, or it's theater, it's dance, which is growing out of an obvious, society, even if it's a micro society. See, where I get a little bit bothered is when it becomes a kind of liberal article of faith, which then means that whatever is pushed onto that mini society, that micro society, is taken as the beginning and end of the responsibility of the institutions of the overall society. In other words, that there may not be, because of this liberal do goody approach, there may not be an authentic flowering of the art which grows organically from that society. In other words, you impose forms on that kind of mini society rather than allow the forms to grow and then nurturing the forms. That's the only.
Where would you like to see your plays performed? I mean, in the sense of, would you prefer them always to be done by Yoruba people speaking good English, do you think? Or, I mean, would you be happy to see them played by Scandinavians with makeup, or by West Indians and a mixture of people in London? Ideally, would you prefer to see them always done by Yoruba type people with Yoruba type voices talking English, do you think?
Um, no, for the simple reason that even the acting companies which have got together have not been only Yoruba people. Um, I've had a Hausa in my acting company, Igbos, Shekiri, Tiv. I've had Ghanaians in my acting company. From time to time, visiting when I was in the University of Ife in the very, very early days. On the old side, I even had a white young Englishman in the company. Don't forget that some of my plays also have, parts which are not basically Yoruba. But it's an interesting question which you ask, because when I got a letter from a Scandinavian company, it's interesting, she said Scandinavia, saying they wanted to do The Lion and the Jewel. I wonder why on earth they wanted to do a play like that. But they did it. They did it on television, and from all reports, they made a good job of it. In fact, I happened to be passing through at the beginning of their rehearsal, and they put on a special rehearsal for me. And I didn't understand a word they were saying, but I knew the play, and what they were doing made sense. So I'm not a purist as far as that. I know that I like to work intimately with my own company, but that company can be made up of anybody. Not so long ago, some years ago, I directed Death and the King's Horseman in Chicago. And at the beginning, I was almost in despair. One thing which I did not want was a broad barroom dialect, American black dialect being used. I didn't want it. It was necessary to distance the play a little from the normal environment of the actors to indicate this is not a play about the United States of America. It's not a play about Harlem. And so I worked them very hard to make sure they at least got a semblance of a distanced accent. It wasn't a Yoruba accent. It certainly was not English accent, but it was sufficiently distanced for the element of a strange other culture play to become evident. And the interesting thing was that even some of my own colleagues who happened to be in the States at the time, who saw the play when it transferred to Washington, did not believe that they were black Americans, playing, not performing the play. They just didn't. They thought I'd brought people over from Nigeria. So I think it doesn't matter at all who, does a play. Obviously, some plays are more accessible to a Nigerian company than other plays, but it's whoever can do them with conviction.
Mhm. Yes, I see that. I suppose we ought to go to this rather grim period in your life of the Biafran War, oughtn't we? When I remember the first thing I read of yours after that was Madmen and Specialists, which I found sort of depressing in a way that Samuel Beckett can be depressing, It seemed to me extraordinarily grim play, and I felt much more exhilarated when I read The King's Horseman shortly afterwards. But I think it's true, isn't it, that during the Biafran War, you, among many other Nigerian writers, began to feel more serious in a grim sort of way, and you found it a trouble to get out of that to a more light-hearted spirit. Do you think that's true?
Well, don't forget that the Biafran War had a long antecedent. The pogrom, the bloody coup of 1966, then the minor pogrom, the major one. And so it wasn't just the war itself, although the war piled on top of other horrors. In fact, the war for me could be a very cleansing thing sometimes. This one wasn't, simply because it was the kind of war in which it is a war which lacked definition. Any war, for me, which has either religious or sectional overtones or even foundation cannot be a cleansing war because it dooms the participants from the word go. It's not. See, you can choose your ideals, so to speak. You can choose your ideology, your political ideology, and you can unchoose them. But if you're born into a terrain, into a community, and that war becomes a kind of fratricidal or internecine war between that community and another, your choices are very severely limited. I know there are those who succeed in making the choices. But then when you even look at them, some of them, in this particular case, made them for opportunistic reasons. Some, it was it was a chance to score back at imagined slides and so on. There was something very filthy about that war altogether. So it wasn't just the Biafran War. And then one also had to ask the question, was all what happened, was it really inevitable? And you found it was not inevitable. And you also became aware of this being a déjà vu. This happened not only here, it happened not here before, and it's happened not only here but in other places. And this failure, this, for me, depressing failure of societies to even learn from other people's histories and other people's experiences, to treat their own experience as if it's something new, and to go all the jingoism, you'd heard it all before. Everybody's been through it before, and it seemed to me that one was caught, in some kind of insane web. It's those aspects, I think, which depressed one. If we'd had, say last year for instance, when I actively expected there to be civil war, I was looking forward, quite frankly, to civil war, because I felt that the issues had become so clarified that one had a choice. You could really choose which side you belonged, among the reactionaries and the, feudalists, or with those who really wanted not just change, but a progressive change, a progressive direction for society. And for me, that would have entailed a choice. So it's not just war. I don't think this prospect of war is, I never find really depressing. As long as it's one which one can choose.
In your case at that time, there was one set were determined to maintain the Federation, another set were determined to break away. You were in the West there, not quite involved. I mean, you weren't actually a member of either of these two sides, so to speak, and you were, in fact, a man who got imprisoned because you were thought to be taking the side of the people who wanted to secede. That was the case, wasn't it?
Well, you see, one of the deliberately suppressed aspects of that war was that, as I said very briefly in The Man Died, was that there was, in fact, a third option. There was a movement which unfortunately, came to grief very early in the war, which tried to break away from Biafra, join up with like minds in the rest of the country, led by Victor D.A.N.Jones and Alele, all of whom were executed by Ojukwu, because he felt it tried to hijack his secessionist movement and use it for a progressive direction. Yes, I was saying that there was this third option, which did not really, beyond its dramatic sweep into the Midwest, taking over there, declaring itself free of Ojukwu's secessionist movement. It wasn't allowed. It really did not survive long enough to make any impact and to offer the nation a third alternative to both Ojukwu, who I suppose represented the secession, and Gowon, who is said to have represented the Federalist. Of course, he wasn't really a Federalist. It's a long story. And a confidence trick was also played on the Nigerian people, because every effort was made to ensure that the truth about this third movement, this third force, was never, they were portrayed as just agents of Ojukwu, which is, of course, was a lie, out and out lie. Victor Banjo's initial broadcast, when he got to Benin, made it quite clear that they were not secessionary, they were renouncing, and of course, the very fact that they were shot by Ojukwu, I think that, that settles all the argument about that. But it was important for the so-called Federalists that the rest of the nation should not know that there was a third force which had actually taken to arms and which had attempted to get away from the the sectarian nature of the war. And so all the evidence was suppressed. Those who survived this attempt were incarcerated, not only for the duration of the war, but even long after the war. Some of them have now written their memoirs, their part in the whole struggle. And I definitely lent towards, more than in fact lent towards this movement, which in fact the Federalists, quote unquote, knew. But of course they chose to portray me as being on Ojukwu's side, very conveniently for them. If I had been in the East at the time, I have no doubt at all that Ojukwu would have executed me together with Banjo, Alele, Ifeajuna, and Agbam. So there's a lot which hasn't been, really clarified. I've in fact thought, especially as a whole spate of books been coming out about the war now, with all sorts of apologists, trying to twist the real facts of history and suppress some others. It's quite possible that I might add a little chapter to my, next book, just about, certain suppressed aspects of that movement. For me, I always insisted on seeing an alternative to the unacceptable um, options posed by Ojukwu and Gowon. And when I caught up with you know this third movement, and found we were all thinking along the same lines, I had no hesitation at all in throwing my support behind them. And the federal government knew this. This really was the crime, which, however, they refused to acknowledge. It was in their interest to push out the propaganda that I was buying arms for Ojukwu, and I'd gone there and I was trying to infiltrate so as to bring Ojukwu into the camp. That was convenient for them. And that, of course, was not the truth.
Some of us over here, a long way away, thought to ourselves, this civil war is not so bad as others we have heard of in history, and it seems to have ended up with an atmosphere of almost of forgiveness and reconciliation. And we also thought to ourselves, well, Soyinka has come out all right, he hasn't actually been killed. So it seemed, perhaps to some of us, maybe this war is not so frightfully bad as others. Perhaps they behave like gentlemen. You know the sort of feeling you might get. How do you respond to that?
No, they
naive?
didn't. No, it was just. See, don't forget that these were people who had no real political principles to fight for, and therefore they shook hands over the thousands of mutilated survivors, over the hundreds of thousands of corpses. You will see that Ojukwu came back and joined hands with the very people he was fighting before. The Shagari's government was loaded with all those who mutilated, who really violated his people, and this was the cause which he said he was fighting for. They were not serious people. They were just, all of them were opportunists. And as usual, it was the ordinary people, the masses of the people who were misled and who were savaged. And of course, the so-called, that statement, no victors, no vanquished, is for me one of the most obscene statements of the entire Civil War, because there were victors, and the victors were, as usual, the elite, the privileged, if you like. We can't even say military-industrial complex. We can only say the military agency complex, because these people we're talking about they have no industry. They don't produce. They're just agents. They rake up their percentages. They rob the national treasury. That is how millionaires, are born. And they're the same on both sides, on all sides, right throughout the entire country. And that is why I say that the Civil War, which loomed last year, I felt, hopefully, would be one which would clarify all these issues once and for all, and range people on very clear sides of the barricade. And these would not be tribal barricades. It would be, for a change, not just a charade, which unfortunately is played out over, at the cost of, tens of thousands of lives, mutilations, permanent traumatization in many instances. The victors, as I said, are these exploiters of society, and they are still very much in business, very much in business.
We seem to have to expect that every now and then there will be a civilian government which perhaps becomes corrupt, or seems to be corrupt to the military men, which is a kind of organization with means of communication all over the country. Then these military men, some of whom may be idealists in a way, swoop down and take over for a while. And I think from your point of view, neither of these forms of government is necessarily better than the other.
No, there's no intrinsic sagehood or cleverness or political sagacity or whatever attaching to the military as a class. Many, in all societies, the military very often are institution men. As we've seen in the great capitalist countries like America, the United States of America, the military are part and parcel of even the oppressive machinery of society. Latin America, what can one say of the military in Latin America? What can one say of the military regime of Mobutu? What can one say of the now civilianized but former military regime of Togo? There's nothing at all which attaches in any particular way to the military. They merely come in, compound the problem, postpone the solution, which every day as society gets more and more sophisticated, more and more aware, a solution which is inevitable, inescapable. Sooner or later, all they do is postpone it. Now, there are certain circumstances in which the entire populace welcomes the military. But the military always makes a mistake. They always misunderstand the reasons why they were welcomed. And they never understand that they were just welcomed briefly. And in a society like Nigeria in particular, there have been two military regimes that I know were welcomed by the majority of the populace. One was in 1966, January 15th, the first military coup, in other words, and this recent one of December 1983. But the question is whether the military will understand, even now, will take to heart the lessons of the past and understand that Nigerians are very sophisticated people politically and understand the issues far better than any single group of people who constitute a recognizable class, like the military or the intellectuals or even the labor movement. That by and large, you only had to watch what happened during the last elections in Nigeria, which are some of the most violent elections we've ever known. I know the Western press didn't tell 1/1000th of the story, but except in quantitative terms, it was every bit as vicious, as violent, as murderous as the Salvadorian elections. It is really life and death every inch of the way for at least a year and a half before the elections. But of course, this fact was ignored by the outside people. And you wanted to watch the so-called ordinary illiterate people in the streets, the market women, the taxi drivers, the long-distance drivers, the garage touts, junior office workers, the factory workers. You need to hear them talking about the political situation in Nigeria. The issues were not in any way ambiguous with them. They were clear-minded about it, and they were prepared to go to very great lengths to ensure a change of government for very specific reasons, not for any sentimental reasons. Okay, there were personality attachments. For some people, maybe Zikwe was the charismatic figure. For others, Aminu Kano. For others, Awolowo, and so on and so forth. But over and beyond this, there was a daily, self-clarification, towards the political situation, which you could detect everywhere you went. So for any group of people in Nigeria, be they intellectuals, be they the professional classes, be they the military, to think that, somehow they are particularly endowed with the wisdom to solve the very complex problems of Nigerian society, is an act of self-delusion.
Do you find that religious beliefs and religious traditions play a great part in these political discussions? I always think of the Igbo people as having a strong Roman Catholic connection, for instance. And of course we know about Muslims, and we know about how many people have been, so to speak, C of E or CMS, of Anglican stock, And besides that, there are all the much older traditions and rites and ceremonies. Do you find they play a great part, these religious beliefs?
Yeah, it would be futile to deny it. There's no question at all that religious beliefs, especially those which harbor what you might call fundamentalist traits, that they can play. And they have played a very important, and very often a negative role in Nigeria. They've compounded the basic political and economic problems in ways which, of course, are very difficult to predict and to quantify. There are religions which have the jihadic complex, religions which feel that somehow they must convert, if not convert, conquer. That exists, at least sections within religions exist, of that kind of mentality. There are religions in which, religions where the structure of the religions is such that religion becomes, in fact, a social issue. and shall we say, the priests of that religion, the mentors of that religion, actually take on roles over and beyond religion. And when they, for instance, are used additionally by politicians who recognize this reality, the result can be devastating and has been devastating in the past. There's no doubt at all. And for me, any society is insane which does not begin by declaring itself a secular society and very vigorously and ruthlessly clamping down on any attempt to use religion to foment any kind of civilian discord. This is one thing which I think many African nations will find they have to tackle sooner or later. Absolutely, just clamp down ruthlessly on these religious opportunists.
I've just been in Iraq, and we were being shown round by the government, round the various mosques, you see, and we were being rather bustled in, a bunch of Arabic poets and a few Europeans like myself, and knocking the worshippers out of the way, rather, you see. So I said to one of these Arabs, I don't very much like bustling in here into these people's sacred places. And he said, sacred or secret, rather neatly. And I think the attitude in Iraq is a kind of secular state in which we tolerate all churches and mosques, you see, but they must not become conspiratorial, and we are entitled to inspect them. I don't know if that's a kind of a way you'd like a secular state to
Well, I wouldn't like to see them trampling worshippers with their boots simply on mere suspicion. But you see, in Nigeria, we've had 2 massacres recently by this group called the Maitatsini sect, and in which the followers are literally brainwashed. They live, exist, they infiltrate society, and one day on the word of they're like normal, dutiful citizens, earning their living properly. But they come in, they start taking over and building their religious ghettos, and one day the word is given. Their faith is slaughter. Slaughter all unbelievers. They had to be, twice now, the army had to be called in to engage them in straightforward warfare, urban warfare. Now, what do you do with groups like that? Once the evidence is there, then I don't see any reason for pulling any punches and dealing with them. I mean, they are obviously a menace to society. Civilized society of any sort cannot tolerate such people. On the contrary, some people are gathering peacefully, regularly. You can even go there as a worshipper and see what they're up to. In such a situation, I don't see why the state should interfere at all. I think this would tend to develop a counter form of authoritarianism. But we've seen and we can see in the whole wide world how religion can become crippling, to society. Iran is one example. Religion has become an obscenity in that kind of society.
Of course, with religions and rituals, we like having them in literature. We like them in your dramas, for instance, And I probably read Conor Cruise O'Brien's book called The United Nations Sacred Drama.